Good evening and welcome to tonight's Bible study. Tonight is Proverbs 5, and at first I thought maybe I should skip this one, but then after much consideration I decided, well, we're doing Bible study, and there are things about the Bible that we may not like or we may not like to talk about, but it is the Bible, and so we will have to go ahead and do this. So, with that said, Proverbs 5 reads, My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight. Then you may maintain discretion, and your lips may preserve knowledge. From the lips of an adulterous woman drips honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to the earth. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly, but she does not know it. Now then, my son, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near her, the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others and your dignity to one who is cruel. These strangers feast on your wealth, and your toil enrich the house of another. At the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You will say, How I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or turn my eyes to my instructors, and I was soon in trouble, serious trouble, in the assembly of God's people. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your spring overflow in the street, your streams of water in the public square. Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you never be intoxicated with May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examined all your paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sin hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. As I mentioned, not a topic we want to talk about, or at least me anyway, um, because the whole idea of adultery is to have sex with somebody that is you're not married to. And as Christians, we sometimes tend to shy away from this topic, but at the same time, as we're going through the Bible, the Bible addressed this issue. As a matter of fact, we see Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount that addressed this issue also. And so I said to myself, rather than shy away from it, I will address the issue, especially because Solomon wants to point out to his son, or to his pupil, is the word I would prefer to use, because the word pupil means either a male or female, a young person who is learning. I was very fortunate as a teenager, as I mentioned earlier in this Proverbs, in Proverbs 1, that my mentor was a 72-year-old man when I was 13. And he was my mentor, my spiritual advisor, and kind of in a real way, my surrogate father, who I looked up to and learned a lot. And as I mentioned, we went through these Proverbs, and I can still remember him talking to me about this whole idea of sex and being a teenager and hormones and all those different things. And as a person, a Christian, these are subjects that can be very touchy, but yet at the same time, as I mentioned, it is a necessary subject. I am very fortunate, as I said, I became a Christian as a teenager. Because of that, I was saved a lot of problems. And I do mean a lot of problems. And For 26 years, I lived and worked in the prison environment, and that environment gave me the view from the other side. And we will talk about that in a few moments. But um, the whole idea of adultery and sex outside the marriage and uh, sex in general and love is confused. Um, as Christians, we are called upon to love one another. Unfortunately, some people's definition of love equals sex, and they are two completely different things. So completely different that many people, especially in today's society, don't understand the difference. As a matter of fact, if you talk to many young people, when a man says to a woman, I love you, or a woman says back to a man, is I love you, what they really mean is they are attracted physically and sexually. And as Christians, we know that that has absolutely nothing to do with love. Uh, uh, Paul writes, "Love is patient and kind," and on and on in that great chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Uh, and so, unfortunately, we as a society have equated the two to mean the same thing, but obviously they are not. As a matter of fact, the Greeks had three words for love, and the words for us as Christian that equates to love is the word agape, which means love for no reason, just because. And unfortunately, a lot of people misunderstand that. There was also phileo, which is brotherly love, and eros, which is sexual love. And unfortunately, a lot of people think eros, which is sexual love, is the word for love. So even the Greeks and had a different word for it. And so Solomon, in advising his young son, said, don't fall in this trap of adulterous woman. In reality, we know that adultery, as I have pointed out to many times, it takes two to fall into adultery. And the woman that was caught in adultery, I always ask the question, where was the man? Wasn't he also caught in adultery? But, that's a different subject. As I mentioned, this is a difficult subject to talk about, especially as Christians. But at the same time, Jesus dealt with it numerous times. I just mentioned two great examples, the woman caught in adultery that Jesus dealt with, and the Sermon on the Mount. Here, the passage that we read, Proverbs 5, the issue of adultery and how we deal with it. And I have to say that the whole thing has to do with our moral standards and how our society has changed. We are living in a different world than when we grew up in. As a matter of fact, the years that I was born, the 1960s, was the year of free love, and women coming out and burning their bras, and all these crazy different things that we have seen. And our society have gone beyond that in many ways. And let me see if I can explain. I remember as a young person in school reading American literature, and one of the books that I read was the Scarlet Letter. And I know some of y'all remember that book in your reading. It was written in 1850. That's 170 years ago, and how our society have changed from 170 years ago, completely different. In America back then, the church was strong. Today, the church is, insignificant to many people, and the church is not as strong. There are many people who claim to be Christians, but they don't live that lifestyle. And so the whole issue of our moral conduct, and I want to make the claim that we all know that family is the basis of our society. And to me, the best basis of our society would be good Christian family. And here we see in this Proverbs, Solomon is telling his pupil, his son, don't get ensnared with an adulterous woman. As a matter of fact, he reminds him over and over again as we read. My son, pay attention to the wisdom of my words. Turn your ears, which we have talked about, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. And he then jumps off to this idea, for the lips of the adulterous woman drips like honey, and her speech is smooth as oil. But in the end, she is bitter gall. And that's the thing about adultery, or any sin in reality. On the surface, it looks good, it looks great, but in the long run, when everything is settled, it is not that good. And so what we have to see is that as human beings, as men and women, we are meant to get married and to be faithful to our wives and our husbands for our entire lives. As a matter of fact, I can still remember my marriage vows to be faithful, to forsake all others, and to commit to one woman for until death do I part. And I remember the vow said, in sickness and health, for richer, for poor, good times, bad times, it did not matter. And unfortunately, a lot of people take those vows, make those commitments, and they have no intention to live up to it. In our society today, the whole idea of someone being caught in adultery wearing a scarlet letter that brands them and make them an outcast does not happen. As a matter of fact, we see our homes have in many ways been destroyed as a culture. And I will address those issues. But here we see Solomon is pointing out at the beginning the whole idea of having an affair. Her lips drip with honey and her speech is smooth as oil. But in the end, it is bitter. As a matter of fact, he said his advice is don't go down to her feet, go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. And that's an important verse for me, is far too often people do things with little or no thought. They just follow their emotion and physical drives. And that's the big difference between sex and love. Sex is just a physical drive, whereas love is more than that. That's why love can be patient and kind and long-suffering and on, because here we see sex, as I mentioned to somebody, a lot of people think that, you make love for hours. The reality, sex is 5 minutes or less for most men, and that's just reality. And so Solomon's advice is, she gives no thought to the way of life, and her path wanders aimlessly, but she does not know it. And I want for us to ponder that for a little bit, because far too often a lot of people don't realize they give no thought just to today and to instant gratification, be it physical, sexual, or whatever, and they give no thought to the future. So Solomon's advice is, do not turn from what I say. Keep the path. Do not go near her door, lest you lose your honor to others. And one of the things I remember as I was reading through the Bible as a teenager was in Genesis, where Joseph was sold into slavery. And then from slavery, he got the fortune where God blessed him, and he ended up in Potiphar's house. And then Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and grabbed a hold of him, and Joseph ran. And I remember as a youngster, my mentor again said, cowboy, when it comes to dealing with women and sex and stuff, be committed to your wife. And if ever an opportunity come up to get involved with another woman, use what he called the Joseph principle. Run. Don't look back. Run away from it. Don't get entangled with it. Because, as he would point out, at the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. And his advice to me was to be disciplined and committed as a Christian. And that's what we need to realize, is that as Christians, we are disciples of Jesus Christ, and we are disciplined. We don't just go to the latest fad or anything like that. As I mentioned, 170 years ago, the book, The Scarlet Letter, came out. But today, that book would probably not even get an interest, because a lot of people, especially as we think about the situation our culture is facing, and even our denomination with the gay, lesbian, transsexual, um, bisexual, the list goes on, and different types of family. But what I really learned in prison really opened my eyes to this whole idea here. Um, Unfortunately, as I explain these things, I hope that none of y'all get offended, but our society has changed so much that the family unit has been completely destroyed. And what I encountered was in prison was a lot of inmates who thought of themselves as quote unquote players. And what that meant was that they went around and had sex with as many women as they could. And thought that, that made them a man. The more women they conquered, the more proves their manhood. And um, you know, and it didn't matter how old they got. As a matter of fact, um, quite often some of the men that I encountered in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and some of them were thinking about when they get out that they are still quote unquote players. And the whole idea that that was what they were talking about really was horrible. And I saw even worse than that. One of the jobs that I had as the chaplain was to pass out the angel tree form. And y'all probably participated in angel tree, where you pick an angel off a tree and buy the gifts for these kids. Um, and part of those gifts went to inmate families. And I remember as the chaplain, I had to pass out these forms, and uh, I'll give you just one example among thousands. One guy had 9 forms to fill out to go into 9 different addresses. And so in talking with him, I found out that he had 9 different women with kids with all of them. And I was shocked the first time I found this out when I was a young chaplain. And he started explaining to me, well, I said, which one is your wife? He was never married. He had all these kids with all these different women, and they were quote unquote not his wife, but his baby mama. And what that meant was he had a baby by them. And he was filling out the form because, if you had kids, you fill out these forms so that the gifts could be given to your kids. And here was a guy who was proud of himself, of all these kids he had with all these different women. And I was just shocked, because here the family unit was completely destroyed. And here he was in prison. He had 9 women with kids. And unfortunately, as I pursued the issue even further, I found out that some of these women had kids with multiple men. And they were baby mamas, because once the inmate became an inmate, she had to find somebody else to provide her with whatever. Um, and it was a rampant thing. The whole idea of, having kids out of wedlock, much less just having affairs, was just unreal for me. And I guess that's part of the reason this was a touchy subject to bring up the whole idea of sex and such. But at the same time, that is what we are facing as a society, where kids are born out of wedlock, and men are having kids with multiple women, or women having kids with multiple men with no commitment, no idea of what the basic family unit is of a man and a woman who is committed to each other for life, and who work together and such. And unfortunately, as I said, the situation is even worse than that. As I heard the inmate talking on the phone, because one of my job was to monitor their phone call, an inmate was telling one of the women he was talking to that he needed money, and she needs to send it to him because he gave her a baby. She was quote unquote his baby mama, and if it wasn't for him, she would not have that baby, and that the check that the government was sending her for that baby was because of him, and that he wants his cut of that money. And um, I was really upset the first time I heard that kind of conversation from inmates. And the reality was it was a common conversation that they would have multiple women with multiple kids and expect these women to send money to them because that was his baby mama. And here Solomon is pointing out, as human beings, that we need to be careful, that her steps lead straight to the grave indeed. As a matter of fact, his advice to us is to be faithful to our wives. And he used a metaphor of drinking water from your own cistern, picking up in verse 15. Running water from your own well. Should your spring overflow into the street? Of course not. Your stream of water into public squares? No. Let them be yours alone. And let me interpret that for you in a real sense. And I use myself as an example. And I was talking to an inmate one week and about this whole idea of baby mama and the fact that he had multiple women with multiple kids. And I looked at him and said, the one thing I can be proud of as a Christian and as a man is that no kid out there can claim that they belong to me. And the reason none of them can say they belong to me was because I know I have been faithful to the one and only woman that I was married to. And so if anybody ever accused me of having a child out of wedlock or having a child with them, I knew that they were lying. And part of the reason, as I started this lesson and said is, I knew they would be lying is because A, I never had sex outside my marriage and never will. I made a commitment to be faithful until death do we part. And that is what it means to be a Christian, is we make a commitment first to God that we will be faithful to him, and second to our spouse, be our husband or wives. And I am proud to say that I learned this lesson as a teenager from my mentor as he read me this, and he reminded me, cowboy, don't get involved with drugs and sex and all these other things, that these temptations are there, but you need to be faithful. And so verse 17 says, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. That your kids should be your kids and only your kids. And he goes on, may your function be blessed and may you rejoice in your wife of your youth, a loving door. And he goes on and use these metaphors. Do not be intoxicated with her love and only her love. Don't, verse 20 says, why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? And that's the point, is we should indeed be faithful to our spouse. I mean, as I pointed out, I was very fortunate. I met Rosalie. I dated Rosalie. I married Rosalie. And we've both been faithful all these years. And unfortunately, that is only found in Christian homes, or society with all this crazy free love. As I mentioned, baby mama with multiple women having kids by the same man, or women having multiple kids by different men. All those things are a part of reality. And, I never blame the kids. I never blame the kids because they did not do anything. They are the result of other people's sin. And let's be realistic. Isn't that what Jesus said? Don't commit adultery. Jesus made it even clearer than that. He talked about adultery as if you lust after another woman in your heart. That is the beginning of the sin of adultery. And so we need to be careful in our thinking. And I'm here to say is, yes, I can claim I've never got in a sexual relationship with any other woman. But Jesus points out that if we look at another person with lust, that is the beginning of it. And as a human being, I had to admit to the inmates as I was in, yes, as a human being, I'm human. I see a beautiful woman and I may be attracted to them. But I immediately remind myself that first and foremost, I'm committed to God. And second, I'm committed to my wife. And I explained to him that I use my head and think about the consequences of doing the right thing. And here's what I told the inmates, and I'm sharing with you today. that most people don't think of the consequences of their action. And I told him, as your chaplain, what would happen to me if I had an affair? First, I would destroy my relationship with God. Second, I would destroy my relationship with my wife. Third, I would destroy my relationship with my kids. Fourth, I would destroy my reputation as a minister of God, my reputation which I have with everyone. Nobody would trust me anymore. And then fifth, I would destroy because of divorce. The verse that says here, in the end of your life you will groan, your flesh and your body will be spent. Let strangers, verse 10, let these strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another. I said, I end up with a divorce. I lose half of what I own immediately. I lose my reputation. I lose the respect from my wife, my kids, my family, my church. And I just went on and explained that just the thought of being involved with an affair was not something I would entertain because of the consequences. And so that's what we said we need to talk about. Because in verse 21 it says, for your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. And so as Christians, we need to realize that everything we do, we may think we do it in secret, and that's what I learned from a lot of inmates. A lot of them, if they did get married and had a wife, and then they had all these other women, they had to do it in secret. But eventually, it caught up with them. It caught up with them because once they had a kid and they say, hey, this is my kid, what they were basically saying was they had an affair outside the marriage. And so verse 22 said, the evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them, and the cords of their sin hold them fast. And so they may do things in secret, think they got away with it, but in reality, whatever we do in secret will be revealed. And so this whole issue, as Christians, we need to do the right thing in the right way for the right reason. We need to do the right thing all the time. And here's the reason why. Ultimately, God knows. And I know some people may take it as a cliche, is that we do the right thing because ultimately as Christians, we are doing it because we are Christians and we are following God in his way. For the Bible clearly says, your ways are in full view of the Lord. You know, we think we got away with it, but ultimately, God knows, and that's the important thing for us. I hope as we look and continue to study the Proverbs that we will see that adultery is a sin just like any other sin, and that we need to live and recognize that our ways are always before God, and that we should be reminded that we need to keep faithful to God first, to our spouse, to our family, to our church, and the list goes on. That we are a people of faith and we live by faith. I will end there with that, unless some people have any comments. The other thing I want to say is next week I will do this study at 4 o'clock as I have a 5 o'clock appointment that I could not get out of. I will then upload it to anybody who wants to look at it, and it will be there. But next week I'll do it early so that I